Brigade, stand by for the arrival of the official party. Attention on deck. Good evening, Brigade. Dr. Richard Haass is a veteran diplomat, a prominent voice on American foreign policy, and an established leader of nonprofit institutions. He is in his 18th year as president of the Council on Foreign Relations, an independent, nonpartisan membership organization, think tank, publisher, and educational institution dedicated to being a resource to help people better understand the world and foreign policy choices facing the United States and other countries. In 2013, he served as the chair of the multi-party negotiations in Northern Ireland that provided the foundation for the 2014 Stormont House Agreement. For his efforts to promote peace and conflict resolution, he received the 2013 Tipperary International Peace Award. From January 2001 to June 2003, Dr. Haass was Director of Policy Planning for the Department of State, where he directed the policy planning staff and was a principal advisor to Secretary of State Colin Powell. Confirmed by the U.S. Senate to hold the rank of ambassador, Dr. Haass also served as U.S. Coordinator for Foreign Policy towards the future of Afghanistan and U.S. Envoy to the Northern Ireland peace process. Dr. Haass has extensive additional government experience. From 1989 to 1993, he was Special Assistant to President George H.W. Bush and Senior Director for Near East and South Asian Affairs on the staff of the National Security Council. In 1991, Dr. Haass was awarded the Presidential Citizens Medal for his contributions to the development and articulation of U.S. policy during Operations Desert Shield and Desert Storm. Previously, he served in the Departments of State and Defense and was a legislative aide in the U.S. Senate. A Rhodes Scholar, Dr. Haass holds a bachelor's degree from Oberlin College and a master's and doctorate of philosophy degrees from Oxford University. He has also received numerous honorary degrees and was a member of the faculty of Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government and Hamilton College. Dr. Haass is the author or editor of 14 books on American foreign policy and 1 book on management. His latest book is The World, a brief introduction published by Penguin Press. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Haass.
Thank you, Midshipman Spratling. Admiral Buck as well. It's wonderful to be with you all, to be back at the Naval Academy. I'm only sorry that we have to do this via Zoom rather than in person, but obviously I much look forward to the day when we can once again do it in person. That said, I'll be honest with you, the last year has been an unexpected learning experience for me, as I expect it has been for all of you. My biggest takeaway, as someone who is responsible for an organization of some 400 employees and some 5,000 members, is the need to associate leadership with regular communication, with explanation, with leveling about what it is you know, but also what it is you don't know. Your parents had it right. Honesty really is the best policy. I'm honored to be sharing a program with Frank Fukuyama, one of this country's great public intellectuals, and with Dr. Anthony Fauci, one of the country's great public servants. I should also add that, like me, he's from Brooklyn, and like me, he's a Yankee fan. Both of these gentlemen demonstrate day in and day out that there are many ways to serve this wonderful country of ours and to make an enormous difference, which naturally brings me to you, the Brigade of Midshipmen. You too have chosen to serve, in your case via the Navy or the Marine Corps. Some of you will give another 5 years after you graduate, some 25 or even more. But whatever your duration, let me simply say thank you. This citizen is awed by your commitment and your sacrifice. All of which makes it a true honor to be asked to deliver the 2021 Forrestal Lecture. James Forrestal was a towering figure for much of his life, especially during World War II, when he became Secretary of the Navy, and in the initial months and years of the post-World War II, early Cold War era, when he became the first Secretary of Defense. And as I expect you know, he was a complex individual, even with the advantage of hindsight. That complexity, though, arguably fits well with the purpose of today's lecture, and I quote here, to enhance the education, awareness, and appreciation of the members of the Brigade of Midshipmen in the social, political, and cultural dimensions of the nation and the world. and with your topic, global resilience after the pandemic. I promise to do my best not just to add to the complexity, but also to help make some sense of it. Let me start with the comparison between the pandemic and a subject you study and prepare for here at Annapolis, that of war. The pandemic was and remains a war. There's an enemy out to destroy us and a population to defend. There's a range of tools to bring to bear, some designed to attack, some to help protect us. It is a struggle of life and death. In my experience, all wars involve three campaigns. First, there is the debate over whether and how to wage war. Second, there is the fighting itself, which always involves decisions as to the means and ends. And third, there is the debate over the lessons to be drawn of what happened. I want to focus my remarks here on the third phase of our current war, on the lessons to be drawn. I do so in part because what we are experiencing is not the first modern day pandemic, and it surely will not be the last. This one is COVID-19, named for the year the virus was identified, which is to say there likely will be a COVID-23 or COVID-25, as well as other infectious diseases. Infectious disease, in turn, is simply a subset of globalization. And globalization is a fact. It's not it's a fact, it's a reality. It is about the flows across borders, flows as vast as they are fast, of just about anything and everything, including viruses, both physical and digital, but also of carbon emissions, dollars, emails, tourists, terrorists, ideas, migrants, refugees, guns, drugs, manufactured goods, services, and much else. And as is obvious, what flows can be good and bad. The virus that has killed some 3 million people worldwide and more than 500,000 of our fellow Americans is awful. But the vaccines, the PPE gear, the testing kits, and the therapeutic drugs produced here in the United States and elsewhere, and that are being shipped around the world, are lifesavers. Much of globalization is unavoidable. Little stays local for long. Think about it. What began in Wuhan did not stay in Wuhan, any more than the carbon released from coal burning plants in one place only has an effect on the local climate. Or as we learned on 9/11, terrorists trained in a remote part of Afghanistan could travel around the world and kill 3,000 innocent men, women, and children in this country in a single day. Like it or not, we are to a considerable extent connected and interdependent. But where choice comes in, where policy enters, is on how to respond to globalization. And that is where the COVID-19 experience gets really interesting. Yes, it was all but inevitable that the disease would spread. What was not inevitable was that it would have the effect it did. What is more, the effect that it did have was anything but even. Some societies escaped with only a few casualties, others, including our own, with hundreds of thousands. Some regions, such as East Asia and the Pacific, are doing much better than, say, Europe or Latin America or much of the Middle East. Even more interesting is that some of the most successful countries in the world in the battle against COVID have been in our democracies, but also so too are democracies some of the least successful. And the same holds for authoritarian systems. It turns out the nature of the system matters less, much less, than the quality of the leadership and the internal cohesion of the society. I would hope that would be a point that would resonate with you all, future leaders of this country. That's also where I want to come back to this word, resilience. Resilience is an important concept. It is about the ability to withstand setbacks and get back up. Resilience requires a mix of toughness, but also elasticity, the ability to bend, but not break. It is a phrase frequently used in terms of adapting to the effects of climate change where it is too late to prevent. Resilience is also a phrase used when it comes to contending with terrorists, as we will not always be able to prevent those who choose this line of work and who are determined to target us from succeeding. In both instances, we need to be able to take a punch and both resume the attack and resume our way of life. Much the same, I would argue, holds in showing resilience in the face of this virus. What these situations and a good many others have in common is that there is no solution available. If you remember only one thing from what I will say here tonight, let it be this. When you look at a challenge, ask yourself, is it a problem to be solved or a condition to be managed? More often than not, especially in my line of work, that of foreign policy, what we tend to describe as problems really are situations or conditions that cannot be eliminated, but can be managed with an acceptable outcome at an acceptable cost, but only if we understand the nature of the challenge and act over time with a mix of discipline and determination. To accept what I've just said is not to become passive or fatalistic, but rather realistic. I feel compelled to point out that such a strategy served us well for the 40-year era known as the Cold War. It stayed cold, and it ended not just peacefully, but largely on our terms. In any such challenge, it is essential to grasp that we are in it for the long haul, that eradicating the challenge might well be beyond our means, that we need to choose a strategy that draws on a range of tools, and that we need a strategy that embraces offense, embraces defense, and embraces recovery. This line of thinking, I would suggest, applies to most of the challenges that you will face in the course of your careers in life. Geopolitics is not a problem to be solved, but at best a condition to be managed. The United States is not in a position to impose its will. If there was a unipolar moment following the Cold War, it is long gone. To the contrary, we live in a world of increasingly distributed power, one in which there are rival great powers, dangerous medium ones, and any number of smaller entities, not all of them nation states, that can still do us great harm. It is also a world of global challenges that no single country, no matter how powerful, can deal with successfully on its own. It is clear that China will almost certainly constitute the defining geopolitical challenge of this era. We will need to be resilient in meeting this challenge, one posed by an ambitious, militarily strong, technologically advanced, and increasingly aggressive China. Those, though, who suggest the challenge can somehow be eliminated by fomenting fundamental political change in that country are kidding themselves and misleading you. To be sure, such change cannot be ruled out, but it is beyond our capacity to bring about. And to try to do so, or to count on it, makes for dangerous wishful thinking, not serious strategy. The good news is that what is not beyond our means is the ability to influence Chinese behavior, and in particular, its external actions. Indeed, this is the classic objective of foreign policy, to influence the choices and to influence the behavior of others. We need to be clear where we will push back, as well as to make sure that we and our allies have the means to do just that. But we also need to make clear the limits to what we see. We should be open to cooperating where interests overlap, and we should accept the imperative of competition. Instead of focusing our efforts on slowing China down, we should devote more energy to outrunning China, to speeding ourselves up. Together, this makes for a resilient foreign policy, one designed to play out over decades in a manner that protects our interests and ideally avoids conflict. Resilience is also relevant to the global challenges that will increasingly define the era we live in. Most, from climate change to dangerous behavior in cyberspace, to pandemics, to proliferation, to terrorism, most of these global challenges cannot be defeated, much less eliminated, but they can be managed if we work with others and if we build or if we adapt international arrangements to help. I expect many of you are listening to me into this talk and saying to yourselves, much or all of what this guy has said was true before the pandemic. And if you thought that, if you said that, you would be right. COVID-19, for all its impact, did not transform history so much as accelerate it. And as we recover from it physically and as we recover from it economically, it will be shown to have been less of a turning point than an exclamation point. The agenda ahead looks much like the agenda that existed before the pandemic: managing great power rivalry, addressing climate change, preventing nuclear proliferation, establishing rules in cyberspace. But the pandemic has been a fateful experience, and it also must be a teaching moment, one that is not wasted. The lessons to be learned are clear. Globalization is a fact, not an ideology. The United States is in a position to take advantage of its upsides and to manage its downsides, but only if we as a country work with others, only if we understand the link between the external and the internal, if we employ the full range of resources at our disposal, if we marshal emerging technologies, if we work to reduce our vulnerabilities, if we choose goals that can be accomplished, if we gird ourselves for the long haul. In a word, we need to become more resilient for a future that is sure to test us. There's one final domain I want to mention that will also require great resilience. The greatest threat to this country is not China or Russia, is not North Korea or Iran or climate change or COVID. Rather, it is ourselves. The greatest threat to America's future is our own political and social divisions. Yes, supply chains must be made resilient, and so must alliances and global organizations and foreign policies. But what will matter most in our lives is whether political institutions and practices here at home can perform and deliver. One can only hope that they can. One can only work to see that they can, as so much will depend on it. The United States cannot be effective in the world alone, but the world cannot succeed without an effective United States. And the United States cannot be effective in the world if it is not more unified at home than it currently is. It turns out that resilience, like so much else, begins at home. I know that you will all do your part. So let me end by thanking you for giving me the privilege of speaking here tonight, and be safe and well in all that you do. But I want to have one last point. I want to make one last point. And even though it is only April and December is a long ways off, I think it is time for Navy to show some resilience, to reassert itself and remind Army who has won the lion's share of the games that have been played. Thank you, Midshipmen, and I look forward to your questions.
See a question in the back?
Third class Beasley. Third class Beasley. Is he gone? 24th Company. With mutating strains of coronavirus in countries like Brazil, who have relatively uncontrolled spread, threatening the efficacy of the vaccine, what is the role of the U.S. in helping limit the development of new strains while honoring the sovereignty of other countries? And are there any diplomatic efforts you think would be successful?
I'm sorry, the audio, I couldn't pick that up. Could you either repeat it or make sure, T, could you make sure the audio is tuned up a bit?
Dr. Haass. With mutating strains of coronavirus in countries like Brazil, who have relatively uncontrolled spread, threatening the efficacy of the vaccine, what is the role of the U.S. in helping limit the development of new strains while honoring the sovereignty of other countries? And are there any diplomatic efforts you think would be successful?
Thank you for the question. It's a good one. Uh, you had a guy speaking here named Anthony Fauci, who was particularly well suited to answer it, but I'll do my best. uh, we should be helping these countries and not simply for humanitarian reasons. Not that there's anything wrong with that, obviously. But I think this is a perfect example where American led internationalism, in this case, providing vaccines, is a form of enlightened self interest. Because as your question correctly says, these mutations or variants are breaking out around the world. And because of globalization, one way or another, they will find their way here. And when they do, they will pose a threat to human life. They will pose a threat to our economic recovery and the return of normalcy. Now we have various options. We can export vaccines, doses of various vaccines. We we already, I believe, have more than we will need here. We can urge companies to create the capacity to produce vaccines around the world. And there's also the possibility of licensing other countries to produce vaccines known to be effective. And we should be looking at all three of these. And I would simply say the sooner the better. Time is not on our side. The earlier the action comes, the better. And I know there are people who will say, well, why are we vaccinating the world if we haven't vaccinated all Americans? But the truth is, we're now at a point where we're essentially able to vaccine all adult Americans. Very quickly, we'll be providing vaccine to younger Americans. And there, again, it's an act of not just help, but it's also an act of self-interest for us to do that. And I think if it's properly explained, the American people will support this.
Thank you, sir.
Over here.
Good evening, sir. This is Midshipman 3rd Class Patel, 5th Company. You mentioned vaccines as a way of the United States helping the international community. Are there any other policies or actions the United States can take to expand its influence?
Oh, across the board, I think there's an almost unlimited number of things we can do to expand U.S. influence. One is, and it's a flip side of what I said in my talk, is by who we are here at home. The greatest way I've ever encountered to promote democracy, to promote the rule of law, to promote the value of markets in an economy is to show how powerful these ideas are when they're put into practice here in America. So to the extent we represent a successful political system, a successful society where opportunity is obvious, a successful economy where people's living standards are growing, uh, others will want to emulate us. I think foreign policy by example is a powerful tool, but we have the good news is we have all sorts of other tools. There's foreign aid of various types. There's investment. There's trade. There's what diplomats do, and by the way, there's what you all do. What the military does and it is an extraordinary tool of promoting influence. Whether it's things like the IMET program, where we invite young officers from around the world to come to the academies and military schools, and they get trained in some of the same ways you are. They learn about, if you will, the professionalization of the military. But at any time we can promote conditions of stability and peace around the world, I think that creates a context in which others do better and where our voice can be heard. So I actually think there's no inherent limit on American influence. But if I have to focus on anything, I'd say focus on what we do here at home. I once wrote a book with the title "Foreign Policy Begins at Home." So as important as diplomats are, as important as representatives of the country are, the rest of the world is watching. They have television, they have the internet, and so forth. They see who we are, and our influence plummets if there's an inconsistency between what we say and what we do. Or to be slightly flippant, we've got to walk the walk here at home if we want to talk the talk abroad and be influential. So I actually think what is most critical to our influence is the example we set politically, socially, culturally, and economically.
Thank you, sir.
In the back.
Good evening. I'm Midshipman 3rd Class Jason Santiago. My question to you, sir, is with the global pandemic shining a light on the integrity of democratic institutions and the rise of authoritarian governments, and how both types of structures have effectively or ineffectively responded to the public health crisis, how do you believe the United States and the international liberal order at large will be able to regain its credibility after this pandemic, and where the future of liberal institutions lie?
Jason, that's a big question, and it's one that I struggle with. Some I just alluded to. I think, and we're on our way in one or two ways in particular. I think the production of the vaccine, the progress we're making in vaccination, that's a real example of technological innovation and then the ability to implement and execute. So I think that demonstration of American competence is a big deal. When later this year the economy is growing at 5, 7, 8%, what have you, I think that will also make a big impact on the world. But I think our ability to do what you're talking about, which is to structure a world which is more stable, more free, more prosperous, that's going to take a lot more than that. It's not something we can do alone. So the revival of our alliance relations and partnerships around the world is critical. As I said in my talk, I think we've got to work with others in building or adapting institutions so they can better meet the challenges posed by the various manifestations of globalization. I still think we've got to deal with the old-fashioned, all too familiar agenda of discouraging rising powers, whether they are great or medium sized, from taking action, which would threaten regional or global peace. And again, that's something that requires us to work with others to be on the scene, to have credible capabilities and commitments. So there's not one thing. When we look at what worked over the last 70, 75 years, when we look at what worked during the Cold War, there turns out to be all these things. The progress we made here at home, the example we set here at home, our alliance relationships, the institutions we built. I would simply say, and you've all seen it from your studies, I think the period that followed World War II, in the early years of the Cold War, basically the late 40s, were an extraordinarily creative moment for American foreign policy. One of our greatest secretaries of state, Dean Acheson, titled his memoir, Present at the Creation. And I would simply say is I don't think we have been equally creative in the aftermath of the Cold War. And in some cases, we may have done too much. In some cases, we clearly have done too little. In some cases, we've tried to do too much by ourselves. Whatever the critique, I would simply say that world order doesn't just materialize. It's not the natural way of things. History suggests just the opposite. And it will only come about if the United States is both the architect, but also the general contractor of the effort. We've got to be heavily involved. It will not just happen by itself. As you know from your science classes, the natural way of systems is disorder, is randomness, it's entropy. But we've got to push back against it, and we've got to do it with others. And this is the stuff of history. You know, we're only 20% of the way through this new century. Well, this will ultimately write the history of this century. How successful we are here at home, how successful we are working with others, doing exactly what you suggest, or setting rules and building institutions, dealing with emerging technologies to promote rather than take away from order.
Sir, can you still hear us? Can you hear us now?
Just very muted. I can make it out just barely. Sorry.
I'll have someone in the back try to pose a question.
Good evening, sir. Midshipman Third Class Jen Sun, 4th Company. Sir, my question is, the United States and China have very different cultures. As a result, do you think the nature of American resiliency and Chinese resiliency differ? And if so, why do you think the American version of resiliency will prevail?
That's a really great question, first of all, so thank you. And now I'm going to do a little bit of tap dancing while I stall and give myself time to think about it. I do think the two are different. I think these are very different societies, very different cultures. We're organized different. We have different intellectual underpinnings. We have different histories. We have different historical narratives. So I think, yes, there are real differences. Chinese resiliency, in many ways, depends upon a large role for government and a society, the building and maintenance of a society where there's a degree of control, I would say, a lack of individual freedom. And the Chinese view would be that this is the best way for the many to benefit. And again, there's a large state role in the political life and social life, in the economy. The American system is quite different. We have a more limited conception of the appropriate role of government. We have a more, be it in the political or economic marketplace, and we put a much greater emphasis on uh, individual rights. So we've got two quite different models. Neither one is pure, and by that I mean China's economy has some elements of the free market. We obviously have a state involved in the government is involved in the economy, and even individual rights are to some extent circumscribed. But there is a real difference. There are some fundamental differences. I think in the long run, I have more faith in our system because I think the fact that we are not so centrally controlled makes us less brittle. I actually think our decentralization in our society, the fact that we have decentralized authority, we have markets and so forth, which are not centrally controlled, I actually think gives us more elasticity, more resilience, more ability to adapt, more ability also to correct mistakes, more ability to innovate. A previous Supreme Court justice talked about the states as the laboratories of democracy. The challenge for us is when our decentralization, when our inability to come together. And I think what we've seen in recent years is some dangerous warning signs of just that. So China's problem is again that it stifles and there's a stifling of individual initiative, and it's very hard to correct mistakes if the policies that led to the mistakes came from on high, which they invariably do. So China has the weakness of brittleness. We have a certain weakness of a lack of organization or unity. And in some ways, history will be decided by which society, which country can better deal with its weaknesses and better emphasize or take advantage of its strengths. I have more, again, history would suggest that, again, we have more flexibility, more ability to innovate, more ability to correct, but history isn't destiny. And I think the challenge for new generations will be to take advantage of our strengths. And as I said in my talk, to do something about limiting and bridging our divisions. If there's something that worries me about the future, is that even though we're still a single country, we are so many nations now with so many narratives. Many of us don't study our history. We don't study civics. I worry that we're not coming together for a common good. And indeed, in many ways, I worry that we can't agree on what the common good is. So that's the challenge for us. China's going to have to deal with its challenges. And in some ways, history will play out quite possibly in terms of which side or which country and society does better in meeting that challenge.
On the top left.
Good evening, sir. I'm Midshipman Third Class Warren Amy from 19th Company. And the commander of U.S. Indo-Pacific Command testified in front of Congress that he believes the timeline that Xi Jinping has for reincorporating Taiwan into mainland China is up to 2027. And my question to you, sir, is do you believe in the 2027 timeline? And if so, should the U.S. deviate from its current policy of strategic ambiguity and formalize some form of defensive agreement with Taiwan?
That's you've raised a question that's on the minds of many of us. I don't know if the Chinese have a timeline, and if they have one, what exactly it is, but clearly they have put an enormous emphasis on what they would call the unification or reunification of China, and they are by their words and actions, they are clearly signaling a certain impatience, and they are clearly building a capacity that will increase the odds they could be tempted to try to do that. Uh, for now, what, 40 or so years, the United States, China, and Taiwan have managed this situation dealing with Taiwan in a way that it's actually a perfect example. So, now, thank you for asking a question of what I talked about. Not trying to solve the problem, but rather trying to manage the situation. And the whole idea was to introduce a degree of diplomatic ambiguity or finesse. And essentially, we've tried now for 4 decades and succeeded in keeping the peace when it comes to the mainland and Taiwan, when basically the mainland China could not be sure that we would not come to Taiwan's aid. The possibility is always there that we would come to Taiwan's aid if the mainland acted aggressively. And Taiwan, on the other hand, could not be sure we would come to their aid, particularly if they were the ones to trigger the crisis, say by declaring independence. So what we've done is, and successfully done for more than 4 decades, is kept a potentially unstable situation relatively calm through what, again, this strategic ambiguity. I have argued, and others have argued, including the admiral you mentioned, that the time has come to revisit this. And the reason is I'm much more worried about Chinese capabilities and intentions. I'm not particularly concerned that Taiwan might do something irresponsible. So I think it's important to signal that we are prepared to come to Taiwan's defense, not just we, but others, including, say, Japan. And even more important than what it is we declare, I think, is what it is we do. And I believe that we ought to be looking very hard and acting on what our studies show about increasing our capability to deal with Chinese aggression against Taiwan should it materialize. And I think this is necessary to deter it, or if deterrence fails, to deal with it. I think the stakes here are enormous. They include but transcend the Taiwan, the 20 plus million people there, the significance of Taiwan to the global economy. But I actually think that what is at stake involves the order that has been remarkable in the Asia Pacific. This has been in many ways the most successful region of the world now for many decades. And I believe this is if not the central linchpin to it. So I believe, again, coming back to your question, that it's important that we do make clear, not just to China, but to Taiwan, to Japan and others, and also to the American people and to people such as yourselves in uniform. I think this is something that we need to be prepared to do, not because we're anxious to do it, but because we're anxious to deter any threats to our interests in this part of the world.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
I see a question on the top right.
How you doing, sir? Midshipman Third Class Morton, 7th Company. I just wanted to ask, kind of to pivot towards another area of your expertise. With the resurgence of the Taliban in Afghanistan, how do we navigate that issue, knowing that that's the only war in American history where fathers and sons have fought the same war? How do we not lose what we have gained and make sure that America's strategic objectives are moved forward in that region?
It's a good question. It's a tough question. I think of all the foreign policy challenges in President Biden's inbox, this one is toward the top. There's real urgency, in no small part for the reasons you mentioned in your question. We've been there for the best part of 2 decades now. but also because May 1 is the deadline that was given by the agreement signed between the US and the Taliban in February of last year for the departure of American troops. I do not favor our doing that. I do not believe that the Taliban are all interested in peace. I do not believe the agreement we signed in February of 2020 was a peace agreement. I believe it was an American withdrawal agreement. I don't believe it would be wise to go ahead and implement it. I think that what we should be doing in Afghanistan is maintaining a small presence, ourselves and our allies. I think we should be providing long-term support, economically, diplomatically, militarily, intelligence to the government. But this is difficult because the reason is, even if we do what I want, we're not going to have peace, and we're not going to have a military victory. Again, coming back to what I talked about, there's no solution to Afghanistan in a good way. What we can do, though, I believe, for an affordable price, a small presence and the extension of help, is prevent Afghanistan from again becoming a major venue of global terrorism. So I think we can accomplish that. And I believe if we were to leave, it would be only a matter of time before the Taliban took over. Tens of thousands of innocent people would lose their lives. Millions of people would lose any rights they have. And I fear that groups like ISIS and the Islamic State and others would once again be able to practice their trade out of Afghanistan. So much in life, and this is a tough one, comes down to how you define success. And what I'm suggesting here is, I think, an achievable definition of success is unfortunately not peace or military victory. Neither one is available. We tried with over 100,000 troops, and that didn't work. But I do think we can avoid a calamity, again, at a price that I believe is justified by our interests. But I understand that a lot of people disagree with me, people I respect. When I used to, sorry to go on so long, but when I used to teach at the Kennedy School, I used to tell students, one of the things about foreign policy is it's interesting. The other thing is it's really hard. This is a really hard one, because when you look at it, there's no particularly good options. And what might be the cheapest and easiest option in the short run, which is to depart militarily, might prove to be an extraordinarily expensive option in the medium and long term. And the other options is staying, don't offer great upsides, but they may prevent or make less likely significant downsides. This is a tough one to assess, but it's a decision that we're going to have to make. We're going to have to make very soon. And as you heard from me, I favor maintaining a modest presence, less for what we can accomplish than for what we can avoid.
Approach 2000, I believe that's all the time that we have for tonight, but on behalf of the Brigade of Midshipmen and the Naval Academy Foreign Affairs Conference, thank you for taking the time to speak with us tonight. Your insights and perspectives were valuable and refreshing, and we sincerely hope that we could have hosted you here in person, but we remain grateful for the opportunity to hear from you virtually. I see that you've already received your gift. Please accept that as a token of appreciation for speaking with us tonight.
Midshipmen's for this. First of all, I will wear it with enormous pride. I'm closer physically to another place you may have heard of called West Point, which is down the Hudson from where I am. So I promise you that when I'm in the vicinity, I will wear this with pride. But if I need to call in reinforcements, I know to whom to turn. But thank you for having me, Admiral Buck. Thank you for reaching out to me. Thank you all for what you do and what you will do. Stay safe, stay well. And again, thank you very much for the honor of this opportunity to speak and to talk with you all.
Thank you, sir. Brigade, please remain seated for the departure of the official party. Brigade, attention on deck. Dismissed.